For over 39 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is Build Situation Room. We begin with grim footage from the area near Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Russia has struck again for the second night in a row, deploying hundreds of kamikaze drones, ballistic and cruise missiles, causing widespread devastation. We see images from Makariv, about 50 kilometers west of the Ukrainian capital. These are images from last night. 12 people lost their lives and over 70 were injured. 3 young children tragically lost their lives in Chaitomir after Russian missile strikes hit the area. And overall, as mentioned, 367 missiles, kamikaze drones and cruise missiles after 264 projectiles already hit Ukraine just yesterday. So we see Putin is once again raising the level of terror against the Ukrainian civilian population. We also see here, it was indeed almost entirely civilians who lost their lives or were injured last night. We've seen footage from Kyiv where people were running to the bunkers and were being shot at on their way there. So very powerful weapons were used. Again, it was those Shahed 136 or Geran 2 drones, as Russia calls them. And we have footage from yesterday that clearly shows us exactly how the Ukrainian capital is actively making efforts to repel these drones. We're witnessing this intense anti-air fire right now. It sparks ongoing debates in Germany, like, is shooting down a drone in midair even permissible? Because these rounds will inevitably come back down as well. That's all secondary here in Ukraine. One simply wants to defend oneself at all costs. And here we see it. On the right side, a Shahed 136 or Geran 2 was shot down by the Ukrainian army. That means, of course, one tries to fight back. We have the information, however, that more and more of these drones are getting through because they come in such incredible numbers. Here again, the damages from yesterday in Kyiv, showing that more and more of these drones are getting through, and the ballistic missiles are also said to have a higher hit rate than before. Because Ukraine has fewer and fewer air defense systems, these too are being attacked, reportedly near Dnipro a few days ago. Systems that were attacked by Russia, and of course the number of missiles, which cost between 2 and 6 million euros each, is also decreasing. This means Russia is continuing to increase the pressure on the Ukrainian population, and Ukraine is defending itself in its major cities, in its civilian centers, as best it can. Meanwhile, Russia's relentless advance in the east persists. New footage reveals Odradne, yet another location that came under attack. We're now seeing here massive impacts from multiple rocket launches within the town, so we're seeing the Russians once again with their typical propaganda videos showing how they attack, first from a distance, and now we're right in the midst of it with fixed-wing drones. I think I briefly mentioned it earlier. Here you can see it. That's one of these drones. With fixed wings that attack with a relatively large amount of explosives, we've seen recently that these are TM-62 anti-tank mines attached to them to strike, and now we're witnessing massive explosions indicate Ukrainians are under heavy pressure here. And in the end, we see the footage that we've recognized multiple times before, with the Russians now hoisting and proudly raising their flags in the captured area of Odradne. So we see the situation. The Russians are showing us that with the drone, they want to demonstrate that they're not just in one location, not just at the southern edge, but they are everywhere there and have now occupied this entire area. These recordings are extremely important for Russian propaganda, as they often go hand in hand with information from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Location XY was claimed as taken, but the Ukrainians frequently proved it wasn't true, showing they still held parts of the area. And that's precisely why this new style of propaganda, where they repeatedly zoom in and out, is used, so that even we journalists can locate the whole thing and accordingly verify it, so to speak. What the Russian Defense Ministry is claiming, namely, that Odradne has now been captured here. And we're taking a closer look at this on the map as well, and we can see we're positioned in the southeast of the front, essentially moving into what was once this specific corner. We remember from the front where the advance from the east met with the advance from the south. However, that corner we still had back then has completely disappeared by now. The Russians have evened things out, and now we're going to step inside and see where the advance is currently taking place. This map here isn't entirely up to date, as it's delayed by a few days. We can see that Odradne is still being fiercely contested at the moment. From below, hope you can see this red line moving up. However, currently we can already assume that this entire area here has also fallen under Russian control. This means the Russians are pushing ahead further in this area and significantly raising the pressure on the remaining settlements. In fact, there are very few left. Oleksivka here is still fully under Ukrainian control. In Bahatir, we have the situation where the Ukrainians, and this is reflected on this map, claim that the Russians are only at the southern edge of the village. If you believe the Russian maps, and in this case it doesn't seem entirely unrealistic, then Bahadir is already completely under Russian control. That means they are definitely pushing further westward, northwestward, and the Russian army is indeed advancing several hundred meters forward every single day. You really have to acknowledge that. The situation is similar a few kilometers further north near Pokrovsk. There too, we have footage of the Russian army, which has once again advanced into the last village before the regional border between Donetsk Oblast, that is the region of Donetsk and Dnepropetrovsk in the center of the country. We see here that Bodanivka has been captured, a very small village but extremely important. It is the last village before the border to Dnepropetrovsk. This, in a way, widens the Russian army's opportunities to strike against Dnipropetrovsk. So far, there has been no fighting there yet, and it's very important to the Ukrainians as well. Just days ago, we heard the Russian propaganda claim they'd reached the regional border. The Ukrainians strongly denied that, and then also proved that it was indeed Russian propaganda. However, it is now the case that we have more and more smaller villages directly at the oblast border under Russian control. As we zoom in here, you can see on the left is Dnipro, the city with 1 million inhabitants, which is still quite far from the front line, by the way. And now we see it here approaching the border to the oblast, that is, the Dnipropetrovsk region. Bodanivka, as we saw earlier, was shown here, clearly just outside the area controlled by Russian forces. Again, these maps we have here are always delayed by a day or two because our map provider, Deep State Map, waits for confirmation from the Ukrainian army, or at least for verification from all involved parties, like, for example, various Russian military bloggers. We can say that currently these areas here are most likely under control of the Russian army or highly contested. And if we take a look at the distance, we've marked it up there, that's 7 kilometers. Then it's only about 3 kilometers from here, and from that point, it's roughly 4 kilometers to the regional border, and all of this is extremely important for Ukraine to defend. We had seen that up here, it wasn't just about Pokrovsk, so the Russians didn't just want to advance toward Pokrovsk, but on the Ukrainian side, everything was done to build up a strong defense here at Udakne, for example, so that the Russians wouldn't cross the oblast border and fighting wouldn't then reach the center of the country, essentially, at least administratively, even if the whole situation only shifts a few meters or kilometers further west. However, we can see that the Russians are building a very, very broad front here, and it's likely just a matter of weeks before they start fighting and advancing in this central region of the country. The Russian advance still continues to come with massive losses on the Russian side. We have new footage revealing that the supposed innovation introduced here hasn't actually made much of a difference. This is the BMP-2M, an advanced and highly modernized version of the BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle. We can see the Russians had a very clever idea here. They transformed it into a hedgehog tank. So instead of attaching nets, they carefully arranged these wires in all directions, hoping that anything that hits and strikes there will be caught, preferably not hitting the APC's armor directly, but exploding in front of it. Of course, it's designed for defense against drones. Let's let this play out and observe that this very vehicle, showcased here as Russian army propaganda, that this vehicle was indeed used at the front days later. And here we now see the Ukrainians' attacks on precisely this BMP-2M, which, like a kind of hedgehog with these wires pointing in all directions, had at least tried to defend itself. The Ukrainians, however, are handling this entire situation in a very systematic manner. Quite interesting, whenever the drone descends, you can see it quite clearly here, the connection gets worse. That could either indicate that there's a jammer here, though that's rather unlikely, or more likely it suggests that the connection simply gets weaker. That is simply due to distance and ground interference. Unless there is a drone nearby that amplifies the signal, this interference is ordinary that close to the ground. So the drone pilots are used to things like that. So we see the Ukrainians are now probing this area. It keeps moving up and down continuously. We saw it earlier. Now the second one comes, goes up again, trying to get right above to aim directly at the target. I think by the 4th attempt, they've pretty much got it. Right now is the proper approach, and now we can see how that armored vehicle back there is essentially hit. We're about to see even better footage, most likely from a Mavic drone or an UAV surveillance drone, capturing it all. And here it is. That is exactly the vehicle we just identified there, with all these wires extending in every direction. The chains are stretched out in every direction, clearly indicating they were trying to block something here. In the end, however, it didn't help much. We now see here the complete destruction of this relatively modern Russian infantry fighting vehicle. The BMP-2M variant was essentially modernized during the 2010s, based on this 1980s infantry fighting vehicle. And we see that what the Russians tried here didn't help at all in this case. At least the drones were not particularly diverted or deterred by it. We now have even more recent footage of a Ukrainian drone strike on a Russian position. And these recordings show us once again how either poorly trained the Russians are, or how little they seem to care about their own lives. We are now seeing the footage that a mortar position is being attacked here. And here is the footage. So that's a small, well, once again, a civilian bus. And we can observe how numerous 120mm mortars are being unpacked and laid out at this position here, simply placed down in an organized manner. They're trying to create a bit of security here, but at this moment, not at all. They're already being monitored by a Ukrainian drone, and this will soon spell disaster for these Russians, especially for the mortars. So here's the process that was observed by the Ukrainian side, and now we're seeing some really interesting footage that shows us, once again, we're in a ridgeline forest, in a typical Russian position. We can also see here there are some nets that have already been set up back here. That's also interesting. Here lie the deceased for transport in black bags, which have essentially been prepped and set aside because they died in the last few days and are now to be removed. And here in front, we can take another look at this. That's the main objective of the Ukrainians. On the left side, we can observe the 120mm mortars that were strategically placed, and immediately adjacent to them, strikingly anti-tank mines of the TM62 type. These just lying there. Ready for action. We see the Ukrainians closely inspecting the setup. We also see more mortars being carried in steadily. These soldiers, each with one or two on their shoulders, are bringing them over to the designated area. And now, it's relatively easy for the Ukrainians to identify the entire target and accordingly attack it with a small kamikaze drone. The 120mm mortars have a range of roughly 5 to 8 kilometers. You're entirely within the effective range of Ukrainian drones here. And now we see the attack. Yes, the entire position is completely chaotic here. Looks like a living room or something similar. So we've got a few pieces of furniture there, just a bunch of stuff. Living accommodations for the Russians who've likely been stationed here for weeks or months within Ukraine. And that's what we just observed. I hope it's clearly recognizable. So here are the mortars, covered with some plywood or something similar, and right next to them you can clearly spot the anti-tank mines. Now we're seeing the whole setup. Ukrainians can inspect it calmly and then fly directly into the fresh mortars. And what we immediately notice is also a massive explosion here. I'll pause the whole thing briefly at this point to show again what we had already clearly established. Namely, this is really interesting. Here you can see it even better. There are at least 10 bodies already ready for transport, which were initially just gathered by the Russians and will likely be evacuated from there soon. Nonetheless, the target of the attack we see now here in the center, that's where the drone is about to fly onto, and that's also where we can now see this massive explosion relatively well. We also see the vacuum effect, pulling everything in from all directions, meaning the Russian soldiers we can't see now, who are hiding there under the nets we just showed, are almost certainly dealing with severe health problems following such a massive explosion happening right in their immediate surroundings. It's a dire situation. But it wasn't just the recklessness in handling mortars and mines that was met with at least shrugs, if not outright laughter, over the past months, but also the way how the Russians have progressed. They essentially shifted, so to speak, from armored carriers to smaller vehicles, then even to motorcycles. There was actually a lot of laughter from the Ukrainian side, saying that this is supposed to be the world's second most powerful army, now charging forward on motorcycles. However, the most recent footage clearly indicates that the Ukrainian army continues to rely on this type of vehicle even in the current circumstances. We have here the 425th Assault Regiment of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, and these are truly recordings that absolutely resemble kind of a mirror image of what we've seen recently. So here we have Ukrainian motorcycles swiftly racing ahead with soldiers on board. Here too, it seems to be said that the protection of the troops is in this case much less important than mobility or speed on the battlefield. One should probably also mention, I think, there's no need to speculate much that Ukraine is simply losing so many vehicles, namely about 100 per week, when considering both armored and unarmored vehicles combined, which means it's partly necessary to resort to civilian alternatives here as well. So we can see the Ukrainians are advancing here now, and these are really, well, kind of one-to-one images of what we've seen from the Russians. And here, as mentioned, we see Ukrainian footage, including from the drones, which are recording the entire scene from a bird's eye view. But it's really just a matter of time, I think, until Russian footage shows exactly that, the motorcycle right in the center. Soldiers moving around in the area, and, as a result, shortly after that, the impacts, which naturally also present a significant and immediate danger to the motorcycle drivers in this case. Yes, the whole thing is quite telling. Of what we've seen repeatedly in recent months and years, that one side always takes whatever somewhat works for the others, or what is born out of necessity, the other side copies. Remember, the Russians weren't experts at all initially, especially with drones. Ukraine long led there. The Russians are now catching up, if not surpassing, with fiberglass drones. On the other hand, the Russians had those garages, those big cages built around their tanks. The Ukrainians laughed about it, and then they built their own cages around their tanks. And now we're witnessing the latest iteration, if you will, of what is supposedly at least a successful tactic, where one side is launching attacks using motorcycle units, however you'd like to frame it, and now Ukraine is deploying its own motorcycle troops, aiming to make the whole operation more mobile, so to speak. As I already mentioned, essentially trading individual protection for mobility on the battlefield. However, what surprises me a bit is that we've repeatedly seen in recent weeks that you simply can't escape a drone. Even if you're smaller, even if you're faster, we've seen it so often in Ukrainian videos that the Russian soldiers on motorcycles were still very easily attacked and then had absolutely no protection. The death rates among these Russian motorcycle attackers were, in fact, extremely high. A technological innovation, initially from Iran but more recently pushed by the Russians, is now being copied by the Ukrainians. We've successfully obtained footage of a newly developed drone that bears a striking resemblance to the Shahed 136, or as it's also known, the Geran 2. But it's actually a Ukrainian drone, and we can see it's named the Batyar, a lighter, more compact variant of the Shahed 136, specifically designed and deployed by Ukraine, and noticeably smaller in size and scale overall. Here we can also see that it can actually, or at least be moved on skis, apparently on this type of surface here. We're also about to see the engine here once more. It closely resembles the Russian one, and now we'll witness the launch using a catapult system. Reportedly, this drone is said to have a range of 800 kilometers, thus matching the range of its Russian counterpart. However, its 18-kilogram warhead is only about one-third the weight of the Russian version's payload. That means the Ukrainians are focusing more on precision or opting for smaller ones here, like drones that actually have to navigate a long distance through Russian air defenses if they aim to reach Moscow or other distant regions, for instance. And that's precisely why they're not using these large, massive drones, of which Ukraine manages to shoot down about 50 to 80% of the attacking Russian drones every single night. So that's Ukraine's concept, to essentially replicate something but then take it a step further by advancing it. And that's something, as we've already mentioned, where both sides of the war learn from each other. They adapt their respective tactics to closely mirror the successful strategies of the opponent. And speaking of the Shahed, we've got another video that clearly demonstrates precisely how these can be intercepted and shot down. In this instance, we're observing a Mi-8 or Mi-17 belonging to the Ukrainian Air Force on the right side. Here he is flying, essentially parallel to one of these Shahed 136 drones of the Russian army, which was launched during the day. At least during the day, it apparently entered Ukrainian airspace. Most of them come at night. And now we're seeing it, well, from the ground. Otherwise, you sometimes see it from the perspective of the pilot or the machine gunner that they're now being shot at. That means the Ukrainian helicopter, a soldier here, is continuously firing at the drone, and eventually he hits it, and now we're seeing the explosion. That means here, once again, a city or critical infrastructure is effectively being rescued by the Ukrainian Air Force in action. But this also shows the vulnerability of these drones, even these large drones, which indeed carry a significant amount of explosives, possess great destructive power, but they are sluggish, slow, and highly visible, particularly in daylight, making them relatively easy to intercept. Not just F-16s, not just ground-based machine guns, but also those old Soviet helicopters. Finally, we'll explore how Ukraine keeps striking deep behind the front lines, even hitting targets within Russia. We have just obtained new footage from last night, which clearly documents an unexpected attack on the town of Yelets. That's a location in the Lipetsk region in western Russia, and here it was a battery factory providing supplies to the Russian army that was targeted by Ukraine. At this very moment, we have civilians on site filming the entire incident. Here we see the first impact on the battery factory. And apparently we have employees of the factory who were standing very close by when the initial strike took place. I hope it's clear now. All right, now we see it here, and they're running away because they've just heard another Ukrainian drone approaching fast. The car is still trying to figure out how to get out of the factory, and now we're seeing the impact right here. This means that Ukraine is also successfully continuing to advance with long-range drones, steadily penetrating into Russian airspace. The Russians even claim, though this should be taken with extreme caution, that they have shot down over 1,100 Ukrainian drones in the last 3 days. I think these figures are greatly exaggerated, and most importantly, we can see that the Ukrainian drones are indeed hitting their targets and not all of them are being shot down. Nonetheless, while Russia primarily aims at the major cities and above all continues to target civilian populations, it is Ukraine that, with remarkable precision and deep within Russian territory, continues to strike strategic targets effectively. And here in Yelets as well, there is still no information available regarding any civilian casualties among the Russian population.